Welcome back to the Elias Makos Show. It's Justine McIntyre today with you, sitting in for Elias Makos. You may have seen this story go by, a declaration from the Parti Quebecois leader Paul Saint-Pierre Plamondon, who says that they want to use robots in order to reduce immigration and instead compensate for some labor shortages. So the party is planning to drastically reduce the number of temporary foreign workers from 270,000, that's the number that it's at now, to just 40,000, aiming to replace them with robots in certain sectors. Paul Saint-Pierre Plamondon argues that despite high immigration numbers, labor shortages persist, and other cities have successfully adopted robotics like South Korea and Japan, so why not here in Quebec? Here to speak with us about that is Mitch Joel. Welcome to the show, Mitch.
Hey, Justine. Thanks for having me.
All right. Mitch Joel, you're a tech advisor, investor, author of CTRL ALT Delete, and founder of ThinkersOne. What do you make about this announcement from Paul-Pierre Plamondon, Saint-Pierre Plamondon?
Yeah, I tell you that my current thinking also has its own counterpoints to it. So I'm open to the debate.
Oh, perfect. I love that.
Yeah, one is, look, I am all for robots doing work that humans no longer need to do. And that is like a macro, bigger concept. Why? Because usually that work requires a very low level of education, which means there's a low level typically of skill to do it. Typically, that also means, unfortunately, it pays very low, and there's a low chance for just individual professional improvement. You're also typically displacing people from where they work. You're bringing these temporary foreign workers from their families and things like that. So at a macro level, I look at it and think robots can and should do this work. We all know that immigration is extremely contentious, and I think that Quebec thinking about leaning into investment, into innovation and technology, which would ultimately, I think, move us forward and create a more highly skilled and maybe a higher paid workforce. That sounds really good to me. Cheap labor obviously makes it easy to not invest in innovation and growth, which I think has been problematic here in the province and beyond in terms of Canada. And that's kind of a short-term pain, long-term gain, a short-term gain, long-term pain model. And then ultimately, too, I don't necessarily think it's about the current cost or numbers or their lack of a vision for what that is currently in their position, as much as it might be just a smart shift in philosophy and approach to move the province and hopefully the country forward.
Is some of this also inevitable is what I'm wondering. I mean, of course, we're talking about when Paul Saint-Pierre Plamondon brings up countries like South Korea and Japan. These are countries with aging populations, countries that have in the past also relied heavily on technology and invest heavily also in innovation. So it's sort of not surprising to see something like that coming from them. But is that also an inevitability for the rest of the world when we talk about aging populations and just the difficulty that countries like Canada have in finding workers to fill these jobs?
Yeah, I think that's part of it, especially when we're talking right now about what is typically physical work. But what we're seeing now with these new generative AI tools is it creeping into the knowledge work as well, which is typically the lower commodity knowledge work, which would be things like customer service and beyond. So there's a bigger opportunity at play here from the technology and innovation standpoint, while also recognizing that there will be sacrifices. We've seen this again, time and time again with technology. Typically, we think it means that we're going to have much higher unemployment, but what we've actually seen is it creates newer industries and newer jobs and newer opportunities. That leads me to be more optimistic than I typically might be, in particular when it comes to AI. But I do think that an aging population is always the case. And we have to look at it as that's a growing concern. You have a lack of access, in particular in Quebec, to hospitals and healthcare professionals, which makes it scarier. And that if we can get ahead of that curve in terms of at least some of the areas here that can be done through either robotics or automation, I'm going to raise my hand up and say we have to take that challenge on, even though with it comes significant risk.
So Paul Saint-Pierre Plamondon was specifically targeting, as you pointed out, physical work. So it looks like he was talking about areas where right now Quebec relies heavily on temporary foreign workers. So areas like agriculture, for example. But you know, in the past where we could have said the abolition of those more physical roles will lead people to move up in the economic system and be able to occupy other roles. Well, as you also pointed out, those other roles are being taken over by AI, and other forms of work are also being being made obsolete. So my concern when I look at something like this is, are we just removing jobs from humans more and more and giving more and more jobs to robots and people who develop them?
Doesn't seem to be the case historically.
Okay.
You cannot make a statement like we're being seen, that like being seen by Paul Saint-Pierre Plamondon, without there being something underneath it around education. And education is both happening at the more remedial level in terms of elementary, secondary, post-secondary, but also in terms of the actual professional development and workforce. We have to always be investing in our people. Now, whether it's going to be the government's responsibility to do this post-secondarily, that would be another conversation. But it is also a message to companies, small, medium, and large, that we know this. You have to invest in your employees. You have to invest in a system that's helping them move along and moving them upwards in terms of being able to pay them more and giving them more equitable lives. That has always been the mandate of society at a greater cause. And I think Quebec could take, in this instance, a leading role here.
Do you think that there may also be other reasons why Saint-Pierre Plamondon is proposing this? Because he's sort of using it as a way of saying we can reduce immigration, but do you think that there may be something else behind this statement? I mean, there are many things, but I want to get your take on his motivation for talking about this right now.
Yeah, Justine, that's why I said immigration is very contentious now. Mm-hmm. And it's a great way to talk about immigration and how we're seeing it culturally and how we're seeing people be integrated into our society, mm-hmm. while also taking a very progressive stance, which makes it interesting. It does make it an interesting place to say, instead of it being about people, culture, how we're being integrated, we don't have room, we don't have opportunities, right, to say, well, my solution to that is robotization and automation. It sounds great from my perspective, from the practical perspective. I've been banging that drum for a long time, not in terms of immigration, just in terms of moving society forward. So I do think that there's something underneath it, because it's an issue that's on many people's minds, both here and in the US, obviously.
Yep.
And this seems to be an answer, by the way, which we can say we haven't heard in the US. How interesting, mm-hmm. that they're talking about these open borders and not one candidate has talked about any form of automation or anything to actually be an answer to what we're going to do then.
Absolutely right. And I guess what I was getting at also is we have relied very heavily in Quebec on a supply of temporary foreign workers to do these jobs because we can't find Quebecers to do them. And perhaps some of the thinking behind that is, well, what if we no longer have access to that pool of workers? We need to be prepared for that eventuality as well.
And you have scale, which are the upfront costs and infrastructure changes that would need to happen for this to take place, which is a massive financial burden, by the way, especially if you're talking about small and medium-sized enterprises. So like I said at the beginning, I can talk myself in or out of many of the points that I have. But again, a lot of these companies are really, more often than not, less prepared to adapt to a lot of these new technologies. But again, you could see that as a negative counterpoint. I would see that and say opportunity. If we knew anything from the early 2000s, which is the post-internet boom, or bust rather, it was that suddenly it became truly viable and most businesses found themselves on their heels a little bit. Mm-hmm. And it took many, many years for them to catch up. And in that time, many of them were disrupted by the technology-first organizations. That's why, in my opinion, at least taking this stance and saying that is better than simply saying, look, we're going to move to a place from 270,000 temporary foreign workers down to 40,000, which makes it the contentious, why are we doing this? How does it look? Well, I'm actually trying to create a path forward. Now, how they execute this, the financial support to make this happen, the actual government support, unanswerable questions. These are people with plans, as we've heard many politicians talk about, but it seems to be a different type of rhetoric that we haven't heard from other leaders.
Mm-hmm. Well, Mitch Joel, thanks for sharing your reflections with me on that. That was Mitch Joel. He's tech advisor, investor, author of CTRL ALT Delete, and founder of ThinkersOne.